What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. So One Night in Karazhan has been fully spoiled finally, and that means we've got a lot of awesome cards to talk about to go along with our card reviews. There's a lot of super broken cards, some pretty terrible ones, and a little bit of everything in between, so without further delay, let's jump into talking about our Karazhan spoilers. So our first card for today is Menagerie Warden, starting off with a really sweet one. 6 mana 5/5 is quite a passable stat line, but the ability is what makes this card potentially one of the strongest actual cards in the entire expansion. When you play Menagerie Warden, you get to make a copy of a friendly beast, and as many pros have pointed out, especially Firebat, this is going to be pretty damn broken with Stranglethorn Tiger, since the card has stealth, and so you can't usually kill it before they actually make a copy, because it just directly copies the card rather than, summoning an extra 5/5 or something like that. It's not just the tiger this card is good with though. Druid has a lot of great beasts, got some other stealth creatures too, and has been trying to push the archetype for a long time, and this card is probably going to be the one to push it over the edge to being a high tier deck finally. Next card is Moonglade Portal. All of the portal cards have been pretty impressive so far, and Moonglade Portal is no exception. You're paying 6 mana for a random 6-drop, which is already pretty reasonable, but you also get healed for 6. Druid usually relies on accelerating bigger minions and has historically struggled against things like Face Hunter and Zoo, so giving Druid access to a strong heal effect that also creates a board presence is quite powerful, and the 6-drop slot is full of amazing cards like Sylvanas and Emperor Thorsen, so you can just randomly sometimes get something really awesome. We definitely expect to see this card get played some amount in Standard, and like the rest of the Portal series, it's a top tier arena card. Up next, it's Cloaked Huntress. This card explores some really cool design space and is also probably just pretty good overall. 3 mana for a 3/4 creature is very strong, see things like Dark Cultist, Spider Tank, and the ability itself is actually quite insane. It makes all your secrets cost 0 mana, and so you could potentially just dump out a load of secrets on turn 3. The only issue we see with this card is that while it does generate tempo, it doesn't necessarily generate card advantage, and loading your deck with secrets to get value off of this card might actually make it a little bit worse overall because you just run out of cards too quickly. The nice thing about Mad Scientist was that it got the secrets out of your deck. While Cloaked Huntress still makes them free, you do actually still have to draw all of them, so it's a little bit questionable how good this card is going to be, but it does have some pretty nice combos with cards like Lock and Load. That being said, we definitely wouldn't be surprised to see it in Standard, and the stats make it a fantastic arena card. Moving on, it's Cat Trick. Man, Blizzard is on point with the puns in this set. Cat Trick is a 2 mana secret that summons a 4/2 Stealth Panther when your opponent plays a spell. 2 mana for a 4/2 Stealth Panther is a really solid deal, even though the cat might not necessarily come out for a while depending on what class you're playing against. Still though, 2 mana for essentially a Jungle Panther is great value, and when you consider secret synergies like Cloaked Huntress and Eaglehorn Bow, this seems like a very solid card for the Hunter class if they actually decide to play secrets. We do expect to see some amount of this card in Constructed because it is pretty nice value and some decent tempo if you can actually get it off. Speaking of secret synergies, next up we have Medivh's Valet. A 2 mana 2/3 that deals 3 damage to a creature or player is absolutely insane honestly, and if you build your deck with a reasonable amount of secrets, well, that's what Medivh's Valet becomes. It's worth noting that you're not actually going to be casting this on turn 2 usually because you want to wait to actually get the secret value, but costing 2 mana means that you can play something along with it, including a secret that of course enables it. Playing Mirror Entity or Counterspell and then this on turn 5 is a pretty decent amount of value and a nice tempo swing. We expect to see this card get a lot of play and maybe even encourage Mage to perhaps play other secret synergies like Kirin Mage. And let's try to speed it up a bit. Next up, we've got Nightbane Templar. Templar is a 3 mana 2/3 that summons 2 1/1 whelps if you've got a dragon in your hand when you play it, which means that if you're holding a dragon, this card is 3 mana for a 4/5 worth of stats, and that is an incredible deal. This card allows Dragon Paladin to have a much stronger early game, and so not just completely run over before they actually get to cast their big dragons. Templar is pretty powerful and will definitely see play in Dragon Paladin if Dragon Paladin actually ends up getting played on the ladder, but it's a little bit difficult to say right now whether or not it's strong enough to make the deck good by itself. Moving on, we've got Silvermoon Portal. This potentially seems like one of the weaker portal cards for Constructed, but it's still a definitely reasonable card. For 4 mana, you get to buff a minion for 2/2 worth of stats, and you also get a random 2-drop. So because of the randomness, it's potentially comparable to a 4 mana card that summons a 2/2 creature that also buffs something else for 2/2 worth of stats, which is pretty reasonable in Arena, but is probably not good enough to actually make it into Constructed. buffing something just isn't as strong and constructed most of the time, and things like Blessing of Kings are mostly just played in more aggressive decks, which this card is probably a little bit too slow for. Next up, we've got Purify, and oh man, this one is pretty much the joke of the community right now, and as far as constructed goes, this card has, of course, zero chance to be played. You have to cast a pretty much a negative effect overall just to draw a card for 2 mana. Anyway, let's forget about this card and try to move on to the next one. So next card, we've got Onix Bishop, which is the next priest card. Bishop is a 5 mana 3/4 creature that when you play him, he summons a random friendly minion that died this game, so it's essentially Resurrect stapled to a 3 mana 3/4 creature, which is quite a reasonable value actually. The only problem is that priest isn't actually played very much in standard at all, and even when it is, it almost never really plays Resurrect in the first place because it has better options available. Additionally, Resurrect encourages playing less cheap early game minions, and that's not entirely something Priest can afford to do right now, or it's just going to outright lose to things like Zoo or some of the other faster decks. We think it's probably a good card in theory, and it might potentially see some play down the line and has some potential strategies and combos, but probably isn't very well suited for an efficient tempo-based standard meta like the one we're in right now. And our final Priest card is Priest of the Feast. 4 mana for a 3/6 creature is a pretty solid stat line for a priest, and the effect is nice since it will get you some extra health down the line. This card is a little bit similar to perhaps Frontline Medic, except the stats make it trade better into stuff, albeit maybe dying a little bit sooner. This card is perfectly fine, and it's pretty solid against aggressive or face decks. The real question is more like, does Priest actually need a card like this, since they already have lots of healing and they already do fine against standard face decks anyway? This card seems like it probably won't see a ton of constructed play right now, but if we ever see a meta fully dominated by aggro, Priest of the Feast might have its turn to shine. Next up, we're taking a look at Swash Burglar. This card is quite similar to Babbling Book in that it's a 1 mana 1/1 with a battle cry that puts a card in your hand. The only difference is that Swash Burglar can get you cards that you normally can't play, and also that Rogue is now getting a lot of synergies with stealing a lot of its opponent's cards. This is another card to help potentially enable the Ethereal Peddler deck. The deck still probably isn't quite there in terms of its power level, but if there's anything good in the next expansion for it, we think it's probably going to start to see play. And Swash Burglar does have some potential pirate synergies and maybe seems like a pretty fun card to play with, similar to maybe Unstable Portal, so we wouldn't be surprised to see at least a little bit of the card in Constructed here and there as sort of like an off-meta choice. For the final rogue card, it's Deadly Fork. 3 mana for a 3/2 creature is a little bit below par, but Fork adds a 3/2 weapon to your hand when it dies. However, that weapon costs 3 mana to actually play. So while this card does get a decent amount of value, since you get a body, you get a weapon, each one actually costs 3 mana, which means you're paying a total of 6 mana for a Bloodfen Raptor and a Fiery War Axe, and that's honestly just way too expensive to actually make it into Constructed. This is a solid arena card, but probably just needs to be a little bit more aggressively costed, or to have had the fork be free to actually see any standard play. For our first Shaman card, it's Wicked Witch Doctor. 4 mana for a 3/4 isn't necessarily that great, but Wicked Witch Doctor also has the ability of, whenever you cast a spell, summon a random basic totem, which is quite a cool design actually. It's a very flavorful card, but there are a few issues when it comes to actually playing it in standard. This card can't really be all that much better than Violet Teacher in Shaman, even with totem synergies, and Violet Teacher has seen pretty much zero play in actual Shaman decks. Additionally, the Shaman class has been pushed away from synergy-based approaches and more towards hyper-efficient creatures like Flamewreath Faithless and Totem Golem, which is not to say that Shaman has no synergies at all or isn't entirely skill intensive, but it's just not very well positioned right now to build around cards like Witch Doctor, and so this card probably isn't going to see much constructed play. For our next Shaman card, it's Maelstrom Portal. For 2 mana, Maelstrom Portal deals 1 damage to all enemy minions and summons a random 1-drop. So essentially, it's an Arcane Explosion, but you also get a 1-drop. In theory, this card is pretty efficient, gets some good value, but Arcane Explosion is an effect that isn't entirely all that good in the first place. It's not something that's going to do a lot most of the time, and a random 1-drop has a pretty high chance of being pretty irrelevant as well. I mean, maybe this slots into some more sort of a control style or spell damage shaman that our next card encourages, but in something like the current shaman decks, which are hyper efficient, Maelstrom Portal is definitely not going to have a chance of finding a slot in the deck. The card might see a very tiny bit of standard niche play, but overall the effect just isn't impactful enough when you could be casting Totem Golem instead. But for our next Shaman card, it's Spirit Claws. Spirit Claws is a 1 mana 1/3 weapon, but it becomes a 3/3 weapon when you have a spell damage creature. This card on paper seems very powerful, but it does require some hoops to jump through to actually work. This card can be good both in Face Shaman with lots of burn, maybe in Thalnos decks with Azure Drakes to enable it, and in Midrange Shaman too, where you can still play Thalnos and some Azure Drakes to enable it, but instead use it more as a method of removal and trading. This card on paper seems pretty strong. If it doesn't get played very much, that's really more just because Shaman has so many already strong cards right now that it's just not worth it to actually play the spell damage creatures to make it work, because the spell damage creatures are quite weaker in terms of tempo. But we expect that you'll see this card in Standard at least a little bit, if not a lot. So those are some of our thoughts on the new cards we've seen so far. Definitely let us know on what your favorite new cards are going to be in the comments. Check out some of our other Karazhan reviews as well. And it looks like that's going to be it for me. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.